Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it? Those are questions for today's Access to Democracy guest, and a returning guest. Always a pleasure to have Dane Smith, the president of Growth and Justice, which is a progressive think tank and really well established and well respected. Dane, welcome back.
Thank you, Alan. It's always a pleasure to come out here and talk things over with you.
Where do we start? What do we do? How do we do it? How do we get our country back?
Oh,
How do we
man.
get our state back?
Oh, man, that's an awfully broad question. Could we narrow it down a little bit?
Okay. Talk about entitlements. You had a great article
Right.
in the Star Tribune within the last few weeks called "You're Entitled."
Yes.
We hear so much about entitlements.
Right.
The right wing saying we don't need entitlements. The libertarians saying we don't
Right.
need any entitlements.
Right.
And
Right. Yeah, I thought entitlements was a good word to revisit. You know, a lot of times words and phrases and images get established, and reputations get built around things, and for no good reason, they never get revisited. And the word entitlements has gotten to be, as I said in the opening to this Star Tribune op-ed, which was on the front of the cover of the editorial section a couple of weeks ago, that it has become the new boogeyman in public policy. Entitlements are represented as the problem. And by entitlements, we mean, it has come to mean largely Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It's typically meant to refer to the large public economic security programs that have grown up since the New Deal, and that really protect a lot of Americans from the vagaries of an economy, of the twists and turns in life, as well as things like layoffs. And we know that these basic programs have actually helped America become the strongest economy in the world because it's preserved aggregate demand.
isn't it amazing that after World War II, these became foundational parts of our democracy, and that we really prospered? And it's
Right.
interesting because I had a discussion with a young man who surprised me by saying, well, I'm a libertarian, and I don't think that we need all these things. And just yesterday, as a matter of fact. And I said, well, what about a police force? Do we need a police force?
Right, that's
Well,
an entitlement.
Yeah, we need a police force. I said, what about fire department? Do we need a fire department?
Right.
And he said, well, of course we needed a fire department. I said, well, what about Social Security? To protect people, especially when they're paying in money to get their own money back. And he said, well, you know, maybe not 65, maybe 67. I said, I'm not going to quibble over, you know, a year or two. Talk about health care. Do we need health care? He said, well, we really should have universal health care. And I said, well, is there a bigger entitlement than that? I
The
said,
libertarian
you're not
said
a
that?
libertarian. I said, you're a progressive.
Right. Well, what I wanted to do with this piece actually was examine the philosophy of the idea of being entitled, of being part of a whole, of being a citizen, and what it means. Just kind of have fun with the word, explore the word a little bit. And so I talked about how even though it has become considered kind of a problem, and even though Americans do sort of favor kind of uniquely this idea of initiative and the fact that you're not entitled to anything, you've got to work for everything you get. This is kind of part of our mythic origins. John Smith told those rich noblemen who came over to Jamestown to carve out a life in the wilderness that they had to work, and they were not entitled to just sit around and expect other people to work. So that is really where this American idea of entitlement came from. It was really a challenge to the idea that in people with inherited nobility and wealth, the old English system, were entitled to stuff, and nobody else was entitled to stuff. So the American,
which happens to be a philosophy today,
right?
That's really dividing this country.
We've got wealthy people fighting to not pay anything or much less in inheritance taxes, so they can protect the entitlement for their children. So actually, it's kind of what I try to do is kind of turn the thinking around on this through this piece, and suggest that the very first principle in the Declaration of Independence was a challenge to privileged entitlement, with the declaration that all men, and of course now we understand that to mean all men actually, whatever color, and women, are created equal. The idea of equality was a radical idea in our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution was set up with the idea of protecting the general welfare of each and every person. And that entitlement idea is really central to religious thought. The idea that we're all God's children, and we all get a piece in this society. We all are entitled to something. And to a minimum amount.
It's not exclusionary.
Right.
It's all inclusive.
Exactly.
Although,
E pluribus unum. We're all in this together.
If you listen to today's politicians,
right,
you would think that it's exclusionary.
Right.
You would think, are people entitled to health care? Do we have too much regulations?
Right.
And I think the example was when you drink water, don't you want to know that it's pure water?
Right.
And when you bite into a tomato, don't you want to know that it's not infected with some kind of a terrible disease or something like that?
What I pointed out is that a lot of times when traveling abroad and you view squalor and economic injustice in other poorer countries, inevitably these are in countries with undemocratic governments and grossly unequal societies where people are not entitled to anything. And the secret to America's strength has been universal entitlement. It's not free. Everybody has to pay for it through taxes. But universal entitlement to education, things like clean water, good, strong public work systems where everyone's free to travel on the roads. And that was greatly expanded during the New Deal to entitle each American to something to eat, which we have a food stamp program. It actually does a lot of good preventing starvation and hunger among poor children in particular.
We still have far too many.
And we still have far too many. And let's allow that. It's probably preferable to have as much private sector employment as possible. This is a good, strong capitalist nation. Capitalism is good, understood properly and with limits and with regulation to prevent the abuses that inevitably occur. But this public investment that we do is all a form of entitlement. And that's a good thing, to be entitled, to be a part of a successful society and to be guaranteed a piece of it.
And it was a very moving article. I try to put myself inside the head of a Koch brother, multi-billionaires, several times over, and say, why would I want to deprive people who don't have from having a minimum?
Just a little bit more.
Just enough to exist.
Right.
Why shouldn't they have health care? You look around at the other industrialized countries We're the only one that doesn't have some form of health care for all people. And
Right.
yeah, I've had arguments about it. Well, it's socialized, it's not socialized. A lot of them have insurance companies involved. But what they do provide is universal health care.
Universal entitlement.
What is wrong with that?
Right. Well, I would argue nothing at all is wrong with that. That is what we should drive toward. You're right. We are the only nation that has a substantial uncovered population that has no access to high quality preventive checkups, the kind of basic care that we know builds for a stronger, successful society.
To the point
Canada.
of 47 million people.
Right.
This is, to
Right.
me, this is
And
outrageous.
this is a segue to another report that Growth and Justice recently produced, in which we study the econometric impact of what we call a unified and universal healthcare system for Minnesota. Now, we know that the federal legislation is before the Supreme Court right now. There's speculation as to whether it'll be completely destroyed, parts of it left standing, or what. We're going to know pretty soon. But even if that Federal Affordable Care Act passes, which expands access to some people, does some things hopefully to bring down cost control, we're still going to have 262,000 Minnesotans without health care. And we're going to have no real assurance that we're going to get this cost increase that has been pretty much unsustainable from continuing. So we thought we'd take a look at what a unified and universal system would do. This is often known as single payer. But there are so many different models of unified and universal systems that
Different
I want to
countries
get
have
away
different models that work.
from easy labels on this. But we know that a system that provides a uniform set of benefits, universal entitlement, access to it, and a centralized way of paying for it through taxes. Let's call it a tax. We could have played games with that, but paying for it with taxes rather than premiums.
We can call it a health care fee. That would be acceptable to Governor
That would be
Pawlenty,
good.
ex-Governor
Exactly.
Pawlenty. Right.
Just call it a fee for what everybody needs. If you have our research, which was conducted by a highly respected consultant in Washington, D.C., called the Lewin Group, is actually owned once removed by United Health. So this is part of the healthcare establishment, very respected numbers crunchers. They found that if we had this kind of system in place in Minnesota, we would save 10% on our total amount that we pay for healthcare out of our pocket right now, either as consumers or as businesses financing healthcare for their employees. And that's no other plan on the table shows that kind of savings. And no other plan on the table shows high quality health care for every baby, mom, adult, child, all the humans in our state. So it needs to stay on the table. There's a lot of things we can do, a lot of ideas in the mix. The governor has a health reform task force that's meeting right now. It's important to stay flexible, keep all the ideas on the table, even the big ideas, the ones that shake it up and redesign everything. There's no question, though, that there would be a cost to this. You would pay a whole lot more to the state or to the single payer, whatever it is. It could be one of the big providers that we have now. That could be the single payer or the unified and universal financer of the system. But you would pay less overall than what you're paying now for premiums. Employers would save $1,000 an employee per year.
That's what people don't understand.
Right.
And
who cares if you pay it here or there? If you pay less and your care is better, why should it matter that much?
And everybody else is guaranteed care also,
right?
Which is so important.
The downside, though, is real. This would be one of the largest deprivatizations in our history. Would be 42,000 people who basically now move paper around for the various duplicative administrative functions of the healthcare financing establishment, the HMOs and providers, they would lose their jobs. And we know that many of those jobs, they would be able to go right to work providing healthcare.
That's
because a
exactly
lot of them
right.
are
Right.
people who could provide healthcare are now doing paperwork. And we think that an economy in which both consumers and employers would have to pay a lot less in healthcare would shift to other useful and beneficial economic activity. You know, this is a complex thing, but we now know, we have a pretty good picture of exactly what the savings would be from a unified and universal system.
We see how well Medicare works.
Right.
At a cost of 2 to 4%, someplace in there.
Administrative costs are quite
Right.
low for Medicare.
And then we look at the average HMO, and the costs are around 25, 24, 25, up to 30%. We look at people who are getting golden parachutes of up to $1 billion when they leave executive positions. Money that's not going into research and development where we need it so desperately, money that's going into salaries in the millions of dollars, and we have that duplication of so many different entities
Right.
where it's existent. And
Yeah.
it seems to me to be a no-brainer, but obviously there is a
Right.
large political segment
Well-
of this country that disagrees.
You know, I don't think it's an easy answer to say that the entire healthcare industry ought to be deprivatized. There seems to be some real benefit from the profit motive, perhaps in medical technology. And even if, under the system that we modeled, actually the only thing that would be under a unified and universal system would be the financing. And so there are all kinds of models out there. There are some like UK, the United Kingdom, in England, where the government actually employs doctors, the government runs the whole system. There are many others, though, that might be more appropriate for the American mentality and model, in which only the financing is unified and universal, and the rest of it is all either nonprofit. Doctors are highly paid in some of these other models. In Germany, they actually have a unified and universal system where you would be able to pick between UCare and Blue Cross or another system. But they're so tightly regulated and so obligated to provide the care that the savings are there for systems like that.
It's interesting to me also. I had a discussion with a doctor recently, and I mentioned England, and he said, well, you know, I don't want to work on a salary for the government. And I said, excuse me, but you're here in the clinic. Is this a private practice? Well, no, it's not a private practice. It's part of it. Aren't you on a salary to your employer?
Right.
It is the same thing under a different name, and that makes no sense to me at all.
Right. Well, it's probably, I've had very successful business people tell me that they actually would favor a VA type system where the government does employ the doctors and kind of controls the whole system. The VA system gets some pretty good marks.
Works very
for
successfully.
Its efficiency, for its results. But there's no question that the American preference for privatization and for private systems is a substantial political roadblock towards a unified and universal system, and we need to accommodate that rather than.
Well, Governor Romney is now advocating an educational system that moves toward charter schools and away from public education, and yet I just read this past week that we have dropped from 1st to 25th in math scores around the world, and I know science has dropped dramatically. When we had public education, we were thriving with both our colleges and certainly our public schools with that type of education. I read that charter schools don't do any better, and in some cases not as well as the public schools. So why would we move to that just in the name of privatization?
Well, we're fairly agnostic at Growth and Justice on charter versus no charter. Some charter schools are doing phenomenally well. My daughter went to one in St. Paul. Very pleased with the experience. Glad that she had the option, actually. But the evidence is fairly mixed. Some charters were fraudulently run and have gone under. Many others, their kids are not doing measurably well than public schools from whence they came. So it's
Which you can say about public schools also.
Right.
Some students in public schools.
Right.
You know, go to the Bronx High School of, what is it, science and whatever it is. Students come out of there,
Right.
and they're really college prepared. Go into Detroit and some of the ghetto high schools, and unfortunately that's not the same situation. Or you could take
Right.
that right here to this state. So it's not just, it's the quality of the teachers and the administration that see that those children get a good education. And I don't think charter, I wouldn't be opposed to charter.
Well,
in that regard.
Minnesota actually has a lot of charter schools that are publicly funded, so they're actually public schools. In fact, I believe most of Minnesota's charters are public. So there's all kinds of ways to get to the goal, and Minnesota's actually stands out, and I'm proud of my state for being an innovator when it comes to education. We were actually the first to experiment with charter schools, and I think this spirit of innovation it works for us. It has in the past. It will continue to, and I think that there's some promising things coming up under the new commissioner. One of the things we're very involved in Growth and Justice is a comprehensive Twin Cities effort to create a movement out of the idea of reducing this gap that we have between the whites and non-whites on achievement and attainment. There's been a lot of publicity lately about the changing complexion of our nation and our state. It is coming on us very fast. It is a good thing that our nation will reflect the face of the world. We're going to be a community that reflects different cultures, that will be vibrant and varied. So that's the good thing. We have tremendous amount of human potential in these new populations, and they need to be brought up to. They just need
the tradition of the last century.
Need to be brought into the mainstream.
As you had the immigrants pouring in, from Russia, from Europe, from Asia,
and those immigration streams.
In
those immigration streams, reactionary forces were decrying their presence. They were there was all kinds of xenophobic hatred incited against them. They were considered to be pernicious alien force. Turned out to create the strongest, best country in the world, that immigrant stream, and we need to continue to welcome
and it
newcomers
continues that way
and
today.
help their children realize the American potential, American dream, and they are entitled to first-rate education and first-rate outcomes. So we have to get after that. I heard a great professor from Harvard at a meeting yesterday. His name was Ronald Ferguson, talk about how we need to create a movement around closing this gap. And he laid out a great model that involved comprehensive investment from pre-childhood, pre-birth actually, prenatal care, all the way through to post-secondary completion, and then beyond, retraining if needed as the economy changes. We need to put more public money in the best evidence-tested ways to close that gap and to bring these kids' math scores up, but also to meet other standards too, to enrich arts education, to improve the quality of education so that these kids get the very best that's possible. And we know it's expensive.
There are people who are hyperventilating when they hear you say that, but it is where we were, and it is where we have to be. And the only way we can get there is by investment, dedicated people to recognize the importance of education.
Right.
Now,
I don't think a lot of people realize how radical, how liberal it was back in the early 1800s when people like Horace Mann and some of these New England liberals were when they were pushing for free, universal, high-quality education through 6th grade for each and every child. Forces in the South at the time, traditional forces, thought girls don't belong there, people of color don't belong there, but these guys and these women, these liberal, radical education, universal entitlement advocates, transformed America. They made sure that every baby, every child had access to this good stuff, and it unlocked potential. Made us by 1900 we were lapping other countries in terms of advances and progress, creativity,
and even with all our problems, it's still the United States that is looked to around the world as the premier country,
right,
as the example that everybody wants to emulate.
Yes,
with all our warts and our flaws.
Right, and our inequalities. And in fact, I think some of our inequality is due to the fact that we continue to welcome poor people into our country and immigrants who are not as well off. So they arrive.
Except where we build fences to keep them out. But,
yeah. But you know, I recently was in a. I was watching a great PBS documentary about immigrants. They simply interviewed immigrant after immigrant, asking them why they came to America. And many of them came they expressed reasons that conservatives or Republicans, I think, they would say, that's why we like America. You know, they would say, because it's easy to start a business. Or, you know, I could be a success here and keep more of my money or something like that. But I was struck by about half of them seemed to say they came to America because of entitlements. They came to America, one lady said, 911 service. No other country in the world does, if you fall over in the street, does somebody come and take care of you no matter who you are. And then others went on with, this is a country where you can be gay. I was struck by how many Middle Easterners who were interviewed for this. I mean, there's just raw people right off the street who had just been naturalized. They were talking about the freedom for gender identity.
And many who say, I want my family to have the opportunity to be better, my children, than I am. Right. That they can attain more than I have attained. And we always attain a lot when we have Dane Smith of Growth and Justice here, but we don't cover enough ground. The half hour is not enough.
It does go too fast, so we'll just have to keep coming back.
I think so. Growth and Justice is a great, great entity, and you leading it do a wonderful job, and it's always a pleasure. Dane, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan.